Welcome, everyone. My name is Quentin Langley. I'm the moderator for Heterodox New York City. So welcome to my hometown. You can probably hear my strong Brooklyn accent. But you're not here to hear from me. And the speakers are going to introduce themselves. So we're going to start off with Kimberley.
Sure. All right. Ooh, should have had this already there. All right, so hi. Thanks for coming to our talk. I am Dr. Kimberley Josephson. I am a professor of business at Lebanon Valley College out in Pennsylvania. So Hershey, if you've ever heard of Hershey chocolate, that's where I am, sweetest place on earth. I'm also affiliated with the Consumer Choice Center. So that's a think tank that advocates for consumer choice, obviously. I'm also a research fellow with AIER, who is a sponsor here. And most of my articles and commentary can be found on their website. And I have several articles related to my talk today. So if you want to find out more about that. And also kind of adjacent topics to CSR, like ESG. So I have articles on that as well. So I began teaching in the early 2000s. And so actually, let me skip ahead to the next slide. I'll give you my little agenda. So, why I care? Well, it starts with a crappy cup of coffee. In the early 2000s, I was teaching at Temple University in Philadelphia, and I had a student in front of me in line waiting for coffee. I was teaching an evening course, and the student was very passionate, very excited, had recently started a campaign on campus and was able to get fair trade coffee now being served at that cafe. Needless to say, I'd never heard of it. I had an interest. I drank the coffee. I didn't like it. But I soon learned it was not about the coffee, it was about the social premium. And that's what really got my interest in cause-related marketing and corporate social responsibility. So why should you care? Well, this has been ballooning over the past several decades. I actually have examples too. I want to point out that I'm not saying CSR is bad. I'm saying we should be careful and we should be mindful of its institutionalization and the standards being imposed in regards to that. I still do drink tea, even if it's certified by the B Lab. If you are staying in this hotel and you go to your little coffee tray, go back tonight and take a look at your tea packets. On the back of it, you'll see this B certification, okay? I recently was on vacation with my husband and kids, and we are obsessed with these follow bracelets. I don't even know if I'm saying the brand correctly, but essentially you buy this bracelet. So I got the seal, and his name is Schnauzer. My daughter's got a shark, Bitney, a giraffe, Idol, and a dolphin named Bill. And you get to track these animals, and an amount of your purchase, the proceeds, go towards wildlife conservation, right? Very cool, right? And I feel like that's worth it to me. It has the cool app, you can track the, so I'm not saying CSR is bad in and of itself. I'm saying how it has progressed, and once again, some of the standards being imposed are a cause for concern. So I will get into why this is a problem and really what are the implications. Okay. So so the title of my talk is, Has CSR Gone Too Far in regards to business education? And really, any of you who maybe are affiliated with a liberal arts institution knows that the business department is a bit of the black sheep. So, we are the greedy capitalists, right? We're the Gordon geckos. And so the idea of CSR, corporate social responsibility, was very appealing to universities, and now it gave a softer connotation to capitalism, and it really created moral agents out of the student body, right? And this actually gained a lot of attention when, if you know U2 and you know Bono, he had the Buy Red campaign. And then Tom's shoes, the buy one, get one, was really attractive, especially college students loved that. That was in 2006. Tom's shoes took off. In retrospect, looking back now, we see that these campaigns were largely ineffective, and even Tom's shoes did more harm than good. Turns out giving away free things doesn't really help the development of third world countries. So in 2007, we saw institutes and programs really kind of spring up at major elite universities, so Harvard, Columbia, Cornell. And so this was really setting the direction in regards to social entrepreneurship. So we're not talking about social media, we're talking about entrepreneurship that has a social impact. Really taking root, and other colleges gaining interest. So this has been going on for quite some time. And my concern is when this was happening, the understanding of CSR and ethical marketing was still not well researched or understood. Actually, most literature on ethical marketing at this time focused solely on the environment. So it equated the environmental matters as one and the same with ethical matters. And we can see the overlap, but also purchasing a product because it is morally good in your subjective view is different than something that we're measuring carbon emissions. The concern over business impact on society has been around for a long time, and some of the famous works are Bowen's focus on how we should just assume that businesses, there are reasonable expectations for what they should be doing for society, but essentially focus on your area of competencies. Same thing with the dangers of social responsibility. Businesses really should stick within their wheelhouse, right? So their main responsibility is face-to-face civility, so just, be good, and then seek material gain, not necessarily seek out that greater, higher calling. And then the most infamous work on this is also Milton Friedman's New York Times article, where he really said, the role of business is business, right? So that's the social responsibility, simply having a business, paying taxes, employing people, providing good products and services. That is something that should be considered as having a social impact. Something that I often use in class is Dr. Archie Carroll's CSR pyramid. This was developed in, well, actually it was a long project for him, and I've since become connected with him, and Dr. Carroll is great. But his framework, the CSR pyramid, was published in 1991, and this is a practical application for thinking about CSR in terms of what are the responsibilities of businesses, right? And at the very base of the pyramid, we have an economic responsibility, and that's kind of obvious, right? You have to be profitable in order to even be a business. So this is required. The next level is obey the law. You have a legal responsibility. Once again, this is required. This is obvious. Ethical is expected, right? So being an ethical in how you conduct and run and manage your business is something that's expected, but it has a little bit more flexibility in that we know views, motivations, expectations, culture, what is ethical can actually vary over time and the context. And so it does have a little bit more flexibility. And then at the very top of the pyramid is to be philanthropic. And Dr. Carroll said that this is something that is really desired, it's not required. Right? And if you are a private business, if it is your money, and if you want to use your profits for whatever it might be, more power to you. That is your choice. It gets a little tricky if you have shareholders, because then if you are putting your profits or financing towards certain causes, certain campaigns, you are essentially utilizing the property of those shareholders, right? That's their property, that's their money, right? So this was seen as something that's desired, not necessarily required. Fast forward to today, and most business schools focus on what's known as stakeholder capitalism. So rather than teaching business fundamentals, how to be profitable, what laws you have to abide by, and then considerations for how do we do business in a way that is ethical, and also are there ways in which business can give back, and usually the focus is at a decentralized level of giving back. So focusing on the community in which your employees live, and focusing on your customers and how you can make their lives better. Stakeholder capitalism, or the stakeholder model, says that students really should focus on their spillover impact on all of these different stakeholders, right? And this can be very complex because there will always be trade-offs. If I want to pay my employees more, because they're a stakeholder, I might have to charge my customers a higher price. If I want to be able to give my customers a lower price, I might have to maybe outsource or offshore my production, right? So there will always be trade-offs. I'm a big fan of acronyms, so I use in class the acronym SPICE. And I say a little spice is nice. You get too into it, too much spice, you overwhelm the recipe or the meal, right? So SPICE stands for be mindful of your impact on society, and really for reputational purposes. Be mindful of your partners, so SP, partners, so those who are your distributors, your suppliers, any strategic alliances. I is investors, C is customers, and E is employees, right? So the SPICE model is be mindful of these stakeholders and how to balance them, but also know that you can never have perfect harmony with all of them. There will always be trade-offs. So conscious consumerism and stakeholder capitalism are now taught in business schools. And actually this really took root in the early 2000s when it became formalized in business programs, but it dates back to the 1980s. I actually am going to keep moving because I know I don't want to ramble too much, and we started a couple of minutes late. But I have the trajectory here of how we see this become more popular over time. And it is actually in line with the eras of marketing. If any of you teach marketing or are aware of the eras of marketing, there are 4 core eras of the production era, the sales era, the marketing concept era, and then the era of CRM, customer relationship management. And from the marketing concept to the CRM, this is where companies began to develop a greater focus and emphasis on brand equity. Not just good quality, good price, but what do we represent? How do people value our brands? And then also, how do we engage with the consumer? And if we want to engage and connect with the consumer, then we must know what they value and what they want represented and what they are interested in. And so cause-related marketing campaigns started to sprout up in the 1980s. And then by the 2000s, it became a very popular method for promoting your business. Now, some of the concerns and some of the implications of this is how it's become popular to really think of business as something that needs to be reformed. Right? And so actually Imperative 21 was launched actually on the 50th anniversary of Milton Friedman's famous New York Times article on the social responsibility of business. And it said, we need to reset capitalism. And this imperative, and actually what's really funny too, is it eventually led to the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism, which was registered in 2015. And that seems to be an odd year that keeps being brought up throughout this conference. So it was brought up in the opening session. I was in 2 sessions were 2000. So I don't know what's going on with 2015, but this is when the Coalition for Inclusive Capitalism was registered. So these are some of the first stewards of Imperative 21. So you see the B Lab, you see Conscious Capitalism, Just Capital. So you have these organizations who now are very much interested in how they can promote a better form of capitalism. And actually Mark Benioff, who is the founder of Salesforce, is also one of the founding partners and a strong advocate for inclusive capitalism. Here are some of the other organizations now that are involved in this movement. And once again, my concern is not necessarily business wanting to do good or giving back or seeing if they can have a social impact. My concern is they're being forced to do it and how it's being measured and how the standards are being implemented and imposed on business, right? And also, my examples, right? Is this tea really morally better than this bottle of water because it has that stamp of approval? There are plenty of businesses that do very good just being a business, or maybe can't afford the certification and auditing and everything that goes with getting this stamp of approval and certification. So these standards and metrics to me are a cause for concern, right? Also, most of these standards and metrics are aligned with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. So we also have international organizations who are now imposing these metrics that they're looking to generate new policies and regulations and legislation about. So we can see that it says, you know, capitalism towards common metrics and consistent reporting of sustainable value creation. I'm not sure if any of you have ever heard of ISO. So this is an international organization that does standards for kind of ensuring quality performance of products and services. It essentially makes trade easier. So I know if you are ISO certified, so ISO 9000, you have this stamp of approval that you meet a certain threshold of quality, right? Well, now ISO has started implementing standards for ethical claims, right? It's one thing to say something's good quality. It's another thing to say that it's morally right. And who is really determining whether or not, that is good or not? I'm going to skip ahead because I got the 5-minute mark. Something that I do a lot of research then is how the CSR pyramid has really been flipped on its head, and also how it's so attractive to students, right? So once again, if I'm an incoming freshman, instead of saying I'm studying business, it's much sexier to say I'm going to be a social entrepreneur, right? And really, these students, some of them are wonderful and great, but I don't know, when I was in college, I didn't know what I was passionate about. and my passions and my interests changed, and my understanding of the world has evolved greatly. So having students view themselves as moral agents early on, before they even know how to do project management, how to handle finances, how to even balance their own checkbook, right? To want to save the world through business matters. It would make much more sense for them to learn business principles, and then as they develop and grow, to seek out opportunities, if they so choose, of how this can have a broader social impact. Some questions, some things for you to think about is really, should businesses be our social agents? Do we want this to be happening? Also, should we have brands competing on issues? So fair trade, I mentioned fair trade coffee early on. So we actually have a lot of certifications for fair trade that say that they are the best at it. What's also kind of interesting is fair trade, when it first started out, it focused on handicrafts and artisans. So if you know 10,000 Villages, to me that made a little bit more sense, paying a premium price for the art and culture versus paying a premium price for a banana, which is just a banana, right? Another kind of concern with the fair trade movement that they've had to contend with is when it comes to farming, they certify small farms, meaning you can't have outside hired help, and you have to be within a certain acreage or land use. So you have to be categorized as small. Now, since I like economics and I like development studies, I'm not sure how that helps a society grow and expand if you can't have hired help or expand your land use. I'm not sure how this certification actually helps develop these farmers in other ways. Here are other examples of labels. So we also can get what's known as cause fatigue. So understanding which labels are legit, which ones are not, which I want to support, why am I paying a premium for it? And then also, even getting certifications can get you in a little bit of trouble. So Dr. Bronner's organization, which really sells soap, is actually has the highest rating in regards to B certification, and they have since stepped away because they said they don't like being affiliated with the other companies who have the B stamp of approval because they feel like they are not doing enough. Chobani got sued after it got its fair trade certification because consumers said they are still not doing enough. So also, some of the responsibility is on us as consumers, demanding companies do more, and it's creating more pressure, especially for those smaller businesses that don't have the capacity or the financing or even the understanding or competency to engage in these social matters. So once again, if you want to be certified, if you want to abide by these metrics, it is costly, right? So a cause for concern for me as I wrap it up is I want to focus more on principles rather than the purpose. I want to focus on profit making because that's not evil in and of itself. It is a signal that your business is doing something right and it's sustainable versus rent seeking to certifiers and really lobbying legislators. I want students to be entrepreneurs, not moral agents. And I also want us to remember that innovation is something that does have a social impact in and of itself. I love my washing machine. I love that it frees up time for me, right? I recently had, my daughter got this stuffed animal that's a weighted plushie. And actually it's B certified because it helps with anxiety. But really we could say any plushie really does help with the anxiety if the kid loves it, right? So social impact can be subjective. It can also be contentious depending on which campaign or which cause you are involved in. So I will leave it there because I think I am out of time. Just one quick thing is, since this is Heterodox Academy, I find it to be somewhat of an alarm when you have all the major big CEOs and founders of companies who are all doing very well, all saying the same thing. John Mackey, all saying that business needs to do more, business needs a higher calling. When they're all saying it, I think that's a cause for concern.
Actually, I'm great that Kimberley went first because I totally agree. 2015 was a really unusual year, and for what I'm going to be talking about, that was also where we started to see some changes in the field where I am, which is in criminal justice education. So I've had this sort of meandering career path. I was a lawyer, initially working on cases involving football, of all things, and then hated private practice, ended up going into public service as a prosecuting attorney, and then being asked to come and actually join police departments to work on accountability and responsibility within police departments. So early on in the 90s, I became actually member of police department, member of their command structure, working on accountability within public safety. And I can tell you that in the time that I've been working in public safety, accountability of policing agencies and holding police accountable for certain behavioral standards has increased, many, many times beyond what it was in the past. So over time, I went from one department to another department, often helping them develop accountable practices and setting standards for the region where I was working to increase. So I went through all these different career steps, and about 15 years ago, I started teaching at a criminal justice program at Seattle University. And about 2015, I started to see things changing for the students coming into the programs about kind of what their beginning beliefs were when we were teaching them. And what I went back and sort of looked at the history of different issues going on in policing. 2014 is when we had Ferguson, it's when we had Michael Brown, and when we started to see a lot of public outcries for changes in police accountability. And that's where I started to notice we have a big divide between what people believe and what's happening, and how to put together a factual basis to be able to have these conversations. So 30 years, I worked on all kinds of different projects. I worked on a 2-year program about coming up with best practices for police accountability, working with the Department of Justice at state levels, federal levels. 2 of the departments where I was on the command staff, we were working our way out of Department of Justice consent decrees and really developing great practices of better community relationships, and also figuring out ways that the public can trust that police can monitor their own. But what we started to see, and this happened about 2015, where we started to see the big defund the police protests. And what was interesting is where we would see these protests generally were in the cities that had the highest level of police accountability already. We saw it in Seattle, we saw it in Oakland, we saw it in San Francisco, we saw it in Los Angeles. So where we're seeing the demonstrations are actually where the police have the highest level of accountability for things that happen. The picture that's on the right-hand side was an area of Seattle which was known as the Chop Chaz, where with some level of approval from the city, they actually walled off a piece of the city and said, this is an autonomous zone, there are no police. And what we saw over the course of the 6 weeks that was there, that there was murder, mayhem, sexual assaults, and millions of dollars of property destruction in just that short period of time. So what we were also seeing during this time, these are stats from 2024, but they are not unlike the years before. But when we actually talk to people who have had interactions with police, police tend to be one of the institutions that has the highest level of trust of the public. So as we would get the survey data in, and as we were seeing what was happening in a lot of cities around the country, there was this disconnect between what was happening sometimes in the media and often in academia, and what people who are actually impacted by these policies thought. So very interesting. It's also interesting to see that they have very little trust in the criminal justice system as a whole, but a lot of trust in the police. But where we saw a lot of the protest and a lot of the activity happening really was in the defund the police, not defund the courts, or not looking for things like coming up with better programs in corrections, but it was focused on the police. And so same thing that we found after we had the George Floyd protests, that this was in large part supposed to be helping marginalized communities have better relationships with the police. But then when we actually would survey people who were in the neighborhoods who were being impacted by withdrawal of police, we found out that those were the people who actually wanted a larger police presence. So all these things swirling around were very confusing to me, and I spent a lot of time in the various departments where I worked, interacting with community, going to community meetings. My husband's here, he said don't mention him, but he was 40 years at Seattle Police Department. So we had grown up in this environment where we were constantly having interactions with the public, and understanding what was the generation of this huge divide about beliefs about policing was confusing to me. I was at a public meeting in Oakland. Oakland is a very violent city. It still is to today. At a public meeting, speaking with a group of people who really liked the police, who were asking for more police, but they had we had had massive riots and millions of dollars of property destruction in our downtown in 2020. And I'm out speaking to the group, and they say, well, the problem is that if you would stop killing unarmed men of color, we wouldn't have so many riots. And I said, well, I've been at this department now for 4 years, and we have only shot 2 people. And none of it, the 2 people who we have shot, and both died, didn't meet the profile of any of the things you're saying. And they said, well, it must, because that's what we hear in the paper, and that's what my kids say when they come home from school, that we have this systemic problem, and the police are hunting down kids in the street. And so I tell, I know there's mothers who tell their children to be careful because the police are out hunting, trying to kill them. And I said, I don't know why you believe this. And that led me to do a number of things, including be more transparent about the data we had in the police department. So that was actually my bureau of the police department that owned all that public relations and data. And I thought, well, I'm really bad at my job because apparently the people don't actually know what's going on. But there's mistrust of the police. There's a lack of local law enforcement. But there was this big divide. So I realized there's this huge disconnect and misalignment between all of the stakeholders, between what we can do to make the criminal justice system better. And as I also, in addition to working at the police department, at the sheriff's office, I'm teaching as an adjunct professor. Frustrating to me as the students would come in and they all wanted to go work at the Innocence Project because what they were being taught in school and what they understood was the majority of people who were incarcerated were either innocent and forced there because of bail policies, or they were there because we have this differential sentencing that we have, and the majority of the people who are incarcerated are there for low-level drug offenses. That's one thing when it's an 18-year-old kid who's coming to your criminology class, but I had this opportunity to go to Harvard and to be a Harvard Fellow. So this was in 2022. I actually got the day of the same blizzard that is involved in the Karen Reed murder trial. That was my first day in Cambridge. And what was interesting is I get there, I'm super excited. I'm thinking policy, law school, and this fellowship was extraordinary. I could go to any class I wanted at Harvard University except in the School of Dentistry, which I had no interest in anyway. So I start in the policy area and I'm starting at law school. And it was very frustrating because I would have these same conversations with professors who are reporting on their research. And I would challenge them and I would say, I think your underlying data is not correct. And that does not go over well at Harvard when you're a public school person from the West Coast to challenge someone who's also on a book tour with their new book and you ask a question in a public forum. So I bounced around and I ended up not spending a lot of time where you'd think I would at the law school, at the Kennedy School, because I found that I could not have an open and honest conversation with a factual basis. One of the things that was great about Harvard is you go places and you send them emails and they answer them and they answer your phone calls, they answer your emails. Had a chance to go to Washington, D.C., spend some time with some legislators who were proposing some legislation, and I challenged one of them and I said, I don't understand why you're doing this. And he said, well, because most people who are incarcerated are there for low-level drug offenses. And I said, that's not true. And I can get on the phone with the Bureau of Justice Statistics and we can talk about that. But he said, well, my staff tells me that. And I go, well, your staff is telling you wrong? It made me realize that I was approaching this in exactly the wrong way. So I found the inspiration at Harvard where I least expected it. I was thinking law school, Kennedy School, Harvard School of Education. I found it in the economics department with Dr. Roland Fryer, who I'm still doing a lot of projects with. He's inspiring to me, and I'm learning a lot about how to make system change. And then the School of Engineering and Applied Sciences with Dr. Fawaz Habal, who taught me about doing complex system mapping and applying it to things that, he's an electrical engineer. He's the guy who put a camera in a cell phone. He said, everyone said nobody wants a camera in a cell phone. He goes, really, I think people are going to want a camera in a cell phone. So when I went back to the classroom, again as soon as I got done at Harvard, and I had since retired from active policing. I'm still teaching. I still do teach for the FBI Law Enforcement Executive Development, and I'm incorporating a lot of this into the way I teach the FBI as well. Not FBI agents, but the FBI training cohort, is I brought these principles back to the classroom. And part of it was, we have to remember the purpose of criminal justice education. So I'm going to go through each of these things really quickly, but this is sort of my new model for bringing that diversity of thought into the criminal justice program, because I can tell you that it's not there. And there's recently a very interesting interaction and panel discussion with two of the most highly credible and reputable criminal justice researchers, David Weitzberg, Anthony Braga. I had worked with Anthony Braga on our gun violence interruption program when I was in Oakland, and they're saying the problem is a lot of public safety and criminal justice research is funded by private foundations, and there is a ideology test to be able to get the funding to be able to do some of these programs, and it's very frustrating to them because they're finding that they can't talk about things that actually make people safer. So one of them has to do with hotspot policing. So hotspot policing, anyone who's been in public safety knows there's a small number of people in a small number of places that commit most of the crime, and if you focus on those areas, you can reduce crime. And now there is a sense in the criminal justice education world that reducing crime is not the goal of criminal justice. Social justice is the purpose of criminal justice. And the thing is, they can be very compatible depending on who you determine your stakeholders are. So one of the things is, starting out with public safety is a basic need, and that really people can't thrive in their communities without having safety. The other one is we got to have a library of trusted resources, and we don't have that at the moment. And so figuring out ways to create the resources. I just finished teaching in March of this year. I actually had to create my own library of resources because it was very hard to find. I certainly couldn't find textbooks that were helpful. So part of that was creating a library of trusted resources and having the students contribute to it, and also critique the library, add to it, get to contribute and give feedback on the materials. Another one was to invite a broad range of people to come speak. And a lot of the people, when we think about who the other stakeholders in criminal justice, they're not included. So I tried to make sure that I brought in investigative reporter. This is Linda Byron, who reports on police corruption. I brought community activists. I brought people from corrections on both sides, the people who work in corrections as well as the people who are incarcerated. This is Captain Robin Clark, one of the best police officers we ever had in Seattle, and then one of the judges from our state Supreme Court, so that they got a broader range of point of view, which is not what was happening. So many of the students came into the class saying, I want to go get all of these innocent people out of prison. And I went to the department chair and I said, we are not serving these students well because there's like 2 of those jobs in the country, and they're not going to get one coming from, as a 22-year-old coming from Seattle. so we're not really setting them up for success, because they're also going to try to get other criminal justice jobs, and they're going to, get smacked in the face by reality that this is not what is happening out there. So figuring out ways to let them hear more, also to hear from the point of view of people who are victims of crimes. Another thing is, because it's so hard for the students to talk about this, they're very uncomfortable talking about things like enforcing the law, and we know that there's going to be a disparate impact that happens when we enforce the law, and to get them comfortable to talk about what are the differences between disparities and discrimination. And that's where the work that I did with Dr. Roland Fryer was really helpful. But I had to use a lot of popular culture references to help them get over the discomfort about talking about it. This is a Saturday Night Live video that talks about stereotypes in policing. I did it early in the quarter. It really helped kind of make people feel more comfortable talking about it. But one of the best tools, and this was the one that I had from the engineering program, we did a lot of complex system mapping for people to understand. We understand that some people think that we can get rid of disparities by legalizing drugs, an experiment that happened in Oregon, and an experiment that also we did a little bit of in Seattle, but to actually look at what the consequences are of some of those actions. And so teaching them how to map and using mapping tools was very helpful. Also, having people understand the difference between complex and complicated, and using some of the Heifetz research. And then we had a time each week where they spent time journaling. Journals were private to them, but for them to sort of think about, are there new things that I've learned? We talked and modeled ground rules for healthy and diverse conversation. This was one of the most impactful systems that we did. We actually did role-playing exercises. And I have all the candy here because they were all assigned a stakeholder role. One of them was the city council president, one was the police chief, one was the judge, one was a public defender, one was a victim, one was a person who was incarcerated. And I had all this candy, and they were handed an amount of candy, and there were different colors and different types. This was your public safety budget, and now you have to figure out how to divide it. Whose interests matter, and they each had to advocate for that role they were assigned. And then I had another person who had different candies who was a lobbyist and got to go around and influence it. And it helped them understand that they were taking on the role of another person. They had a tactile tool to use to talk about how do I divide resources in public safety. And it helped them develop a lot of different perspectives about the balances in the public safety system. So always appreciate other ideas about how to incorporate tools in the classroom to bring some of that viewpoint diversity, especially in those areas where it's difficult or uncomfortable or people are coming with preconceived ideas. Always appreciate any suggestions you have. So thanks very much.
Hi everyone, happy to be here. My name is Dr. Miriam Thompson. I'm an associate teaching professor at the University of California, Santa Barbara, and I'm also the director of the Mind and Behavior Assessment Clinic. And so I primarily teach courses on assessment. So cognitive assessment, you can think about IQ tests, personality assessment, and behavior assessment and neuropsychological assessment as well. So happy to be here. And I was also added at the last minute, so you may not see my name on the program. Okay, so moving forward, so what is school psychology? I'm a school psychologist by training, and I primarily teach. My goal is to train students in the field of school psychology to go out and become school psychologists or practitioners of school psychology. So school psychology is focused on the psychological, cognitive, academic, social, emotional, and behavioral functioning of students. And school psychologists conduct assessments, they complete observations, implement interventions, write psychological reports, make decisions about student special education eligibility, work closely with students, parents, teachers, administrators, and others in determining how to best support students in achieving the best possible outcomes. Some of the top issues that are impacting U.S. school children are emotional and behavioral regulation challenges, anxiety and depression, academic underperformance, absenteeism, and poverty. And this is from the Pew Research Center. So looking at contemporary school psychology research, there's been an increase in the number of publications addressing culture, race, and ethnicity, but the increase of the publications does not thoroughly or accurately capture many of these aforementioned issues here. So what the focus has been to focus on the impact racism, racial disparities, racial bias, and cultural competency has on students. Primacy of identity is of the focus. Critical theory is a common theoretical framework. And while these issues are important, they don't capture the entirety of the issue. Researchers to the field of school psychology have a responsibility to investigate the different ways in which school problems can be conceptualized that does not always identify race or racism as the cause of these issues. Certainly, these forces have an impact on people and may help to explain some of the disparities, but different explanations for disparities in educational attainment or special education must be considered. Empowerment theory can reconceptualize these issues as real yet surmountable challenges. And Eric Smith, who is an attendee here, I cite him here, and he works at the Cato Institute. So empowerment theory frames these issues through an asset lens, describing individuals as capable self-change agents. And there's three different components: interpersonal, interactional, behavioral. And so with interpersonal, that refers to how you talk to yourself, how you regulate your emotions. Interactional, that refers to social awareness, empathy building. And behavioral looks at like teamwork and collaboration, how well you get along with others. All of these things help you to be, a great, capable person who is emboldened enough to, overcome the circumstances. Here in this room, we've all experienced adversity. We're all dealt with a set of cards that we have no control over, but it's up to us to figure out how we overcome those challenges. And certainly where we live, where we grow up, and our parents play a certain role. But anyway, so back to the topic at hand, I completed a systematic review of school psychology research, and I'll discuss the results of that systematic review of school psychology literature that was conducted in the past 10 years on culture, race, and ethnicity. I'll discuss how these articles I reviewed can be reconceptualized, not just via empowerment theory, but provide suggestions on how the research can be conducted differently that captures underexplored but possible issues. So looking at the systematic review, here's some of the criteria that I included in my review. So I used the following search words: race, racism, bias, racial disparities, with the following date range: 2014 to 2024. The type of research I looked at was empirical, age groups, kindergarten through 12th grade, or grades K through 12, ages 5 to 18, in schools, and in the field of study, school psychology, which overlaps closely with educational psychology as well. So the search yielded 43 articles. However, 11 of those articles didn't meet inclusion criteria, so they were discarded. So some of these articles were conceptual in nature, they weren't empirical, or they weren't set in schools. 32 of those articles ended up being included in this systematic review. I'll walk you through some of the descriptive analyses. So first, we'll take a look at the research methods. So the majority of the research that I reviewed used quantitative research methods. So most of it was experimental, most of it used data sets. So looking at large swaths of data, so like discipline records, for example, tended to be the most common way to that a lot of this quantitative research was conducted: surveys, experimental research, some longitudinal studies. Only 4 of the articles used qualitative research methods, so IPA, interpretive phenomenological analyses, content analysis, interviews, narrative. So again, only 4 articles. The most common theoretical frameworks was critical research, or critical race theory, PVES, which is phenomenological variant ecological systems theory, cultural synchrony hypothesis, and defect craft, which is an uncommon one, and that analyzes the intersection of disability and racial disparities in education. The most common academic journals, as you might expect, were discipline-specific journals that looked at school psychology. There were more journals listed, but these are just some of the top journals that were that I saw. And the top keywords, so the keywords that you see in the articles, these were the top ones. And interestingly enough, discipline was the top. Some of the discipline, bias, disparities, those were some of the top keywords that were included in a lot of the articles that I reviewed. Now, I want to go off on a brief tangent. Only 3 articles had positionality statements. So I want to bring this to your attention. Well, first, let me just provide you a definition. So positionality statements, known as reflexivity statements, is a reflection of the author's identity and how the role of identity may have had an impact on the study and how it relates to how their identity may impact, again, the quality of the research. And it also recognizes the limitations and privileges the researcher has so that readers know, how their background might have influenced findings. So here, again, this author is also attendee here at this conference. So in his article, Positionality and Its Problems, the author states that, providing these positionality statements fails to adhere to scientific ethos because there's too much focus on the research. Why do I care that you are, a white woman who's heterosexual from an upper middle class background, who's highly educated, researching underserved Black kids in the Bronx, I understand that the intent is there, but it's so distracting and it can be kind of insulting. So you're highly educated background and you're here to support these, poor, underserved students of color. But good research should be judged by its own merits. And because researchers disclose personally identifying information, it really does undermine the peer review process. I review a ton of manuscripts. I don't conduct a ton of empirical research myself. My primary job at my institution is teach. So I train students to become school psychologists. So I'm a trainer, I direct a psychology assessment clinic, but I consume a ton of research. And I find that it frequently undermines the peer review process. I was able to identify a colleague in the field by her own self-statement. So it's problematic. So I offer you here the purpose as to why I'm here. Reconceptualization of selected articles. Of course, I can't go through all 32 articles, but here I provide you all with a selection. So looking at discipline. Teachers' anti-Black biases and discipline decisions, the role of mindfulness. So this was an experimental study. White teachers were asked to read a fictitious study file that illustrated 2 instances of misbehavior in the classroom. The misbehavior was committed by a target student with a stereotypically Black name, such as Laquan, Terrell, or a white name, Tanner or Spencer. The results of the study found that lower levels of mindfulness were associated with more severe discipline decisions, and higher levels of mindfulness were associated with more lenient discipline decisions. And you see that I have that bolded, more lenient discipline decisions, if the infraction was committed by a Black male student as opposed to a white male student. So here's how I would reapproach it. I would provide a survey with open-ended questions and like-art items for white teachers asking, based on your years of teaching, what do you think Black boys need to be successful? What types of issues have you observed that have led Black boys to receive disciplinary infractions in your classrooms? Do you think that you've ever provided differential disciplinary procedures to a student based upon their race? Do you think that mindfulness will help you to reduce your biases if you have any? If Black boys have received more disciplinary referrals, what would you attribute this to? What strengths do you think Black boys need to be successful? What types of issues have you observed that have led Black boys to receive disciplinary infractions in your classrooms? And are there particular cultural variables that help or hinder the success of Black boys in the classroom? Here's another study, an examination of restorative interventions and racial equity and out-of-school suspensions. This was a data set analysis. So they reviewed discipline records from Denver public schools. The authors explored whether factors are associated with equitable assignment of out-of-school suspensions, and the results indicated that regardless of race, students' participation in restorative interventions reduced their likelihood of receiving out-of-school suspensions. And restorative interventions and other alternative suspensions did not seem to result in substantial benefits to Black students. Here's how I would reapproach it. I would conduct focus groups with the students asking their thoughts on restorative interventions. I'd ask the disciplined students, and of course you'd have to figure out how appropriate this is, if they found restorative intervention effective in managing their behaviors. I'd ask parents their perceptions of restorative interventions whose children are involved in this practice for disciplinary reasons. What does the impacted party, the person who is impacted by the disciplined individual, think of the other students' participation in restorative interventions? How do we even determine the appropriateness of restorative interventions? And are there instances in which it would be inappropriate to implement a restorative intervention? And finally, how does one determine the sincerity of the disciplined person's participation in the restorative intervention? Because the goal here is to reduce out-of-school suspensions, but is there any appreciation for the consequences of their behavior? Moving on to intellectual assessment. As you know, I'm the director of of the Mind and Behavior Assessment Clinic, so this is of particular interest to me. So in this study, the authors conducted survey research. So they sampled school psychologists working in school districts in the Northeast, and the participants completed a survey which asked questions about their current evaluation practices with Black school children. And the survey results showed that many participants believed that intellectual assessments were biased against Black students, and that IQ tests contained language and concepts that could affect their performance. So here would be better questions to reframe this research. What are examples of biased items on IQ test? How do you determine whether an assessment is biased against Black students? What constitutes culturally appropriate assessments? What are examples of culturally biased intellectual assessments? Are assessments such as the Wechsler Adult Intelligence Scale, the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for children, the Differential Ability Scale, the Woodcock-Johnson Test of Cognitive Abilities, are those biased against Black children? What would be the best way to assess the intellectual functioning of Black students? And due to the historical misuse of IQ tests and the assessment of Black kids, should there be a nationwide ban? In the state of California, where I'm coming from, up until 2020 or up until 2023, you couldn't administer an IQ test on Black kids due to the historical misuse, because Black students, were overrepresented in EMR classes. So again, does that do more harm than good? And then finally, disproportionality. Our school psychologists' special education eligibility decisions reliable and unbiased. And so this is experimental research. And here the authors explored whether school psychologists' special education eligibility decisions were reliable and unbiased. And so this research was conducted by having participants review simulated cases of elementary school students referred for special education services and having to determine the appropriateness of their placement in education placement category. And here the results determined that disproportionality is not due to school psychologists' racial bias and their eligibility determinations. And here, just quickly, due to the overrepresentation of students of color in special education, are white school psychologists reluctant to find them eligible for special education? And again, due to racial disproportionality in special education, do school psychologists implicitly or explicitly engage in compensatory behaviors during assessment administration that may make the finding of certain assessment scores, which may result in their ineligibility for special education? And finally, are school psychologists at risk for overcorrecting the issue by finding alternative reasons? And then for the very last variable here, if racial bias is not the cause for just disproportionality in special education, what in fact is the cause of that phenomenon? So here, I found a couple of interesting conclusions. Asking different questions and using different methods is really needed in school psychology research. More research needs to focus on the why instead of the what. Many articles use data sets to identify correlations, trends, associations. For example, increased out-of-school suspensions are linked to truancy, or meditation at the start of the school day results in more positive educational outcomes. I find that a lot of these findings, lay people could conclude. And so I feel as though, I believe as though that we need to be conducting, different, forming different questions from a different perspective and exploring alternative explanations for research findings, looking at, less popular but positive but possible explanations. Ogbu and Simmons talked about the idea of voluntary minorities and involuntary minorities. So And voluntary minorities include, Amish, Jews, Mormons who made the decision to leave their home country and move to the United States to make it their home. And they may have more positive attitudes towards school, learning, and teachers. And these are just generalizations. I'm sure there are, distinctions. And involuntary minorities include Black Americans who are part of the African diaspora who were forcibly removed from their homeland and may develop what's known as an oppositional identity. Anything that approximates, mastery of school curriculum, speaking and writing standard English, engaging in good school behaviors, could be reviewed as white society's requirements. And could this be a potential reason why there's academic underperformance or increased disciplinary referrals among Black American students? We also need more practical research with feasible solutions. So a lot of the research literature has these lofty, grandiose recommendations that just aren't feasible in immediate implementation. So diversifying the workforce, that's great, but that takes time. Changing policies, that requires buy-in, time and money. Cultural competency training, again, time, money, resource. You need to get teachers to commit to participating in these trainings. And same thing with transforming curriculum. You need to have buy-in from policymakers. But what may be more immediate and certainly more practical is engaging parents more, encouraging parents to volunteer in schools, creating mentoring programs, for example, figuring out how to increase transparency. And this isn't a criticism. I understand that, I always tell my students that academia is not the real world. Academia is what you can make it your own. And so you come up with these lofty recommendations that you hope somehow will be implemented. But, the direction that I like to take these future systematic reviews is to explore these journals that I have listed here and looking at some of the non-empirical conceptual articles. And I believe I may be at time, so thank you for listening. And if you have any questions or feedback, here's my contact information.
Wow, fantastic, guys. So who has a question? Who wants to start off?
So I actually came here for the CSR because I'm an accounting professor and I'm working on a case. But Miriam, your presentation, I'll come back to you. I was the director of a school of accountancy at the largest business school in America in Atlanta. And we have a very strong first generation group of students. And I will tell you the work, and it was all during COVID, we had to do, and we're a research institution, so I'm hiring faculty who are from our top schools who are fighting to make tenure, and they're trying to teach these undergraduate courses where 30% of the students would come to class and they wouldn't read, they wouldn't do the homework, and then those same faculty were accused of being racist if they had high DWF rates. And so have you ever had anyone come to you and say, how do we turn this around? How do we make sure that our first generation students are ready when they come to college to work hard and set themselves up for success?
So, at my institution or in my field, no one's ever approached me with that question because, to be quite honest, I'm kind of flying under the radar here with a lot of my perspectives. But now that I got tenure last year, thank you. No, I'm starting to become more vocal about it. I feel certainly more emboldened and more comfortable just speaking about these issues. And it doesn't mean that, there aren't real challenges, but I just think I need to just be more vocal. And those are issues that are just rampant, and I find those to be issues as well. But I think just kind of naming the issue and just being honest about it, and I certainly feel a lot more comfortable to do so. But I understand what you're saying.
Who wants to come in next?
This is for Kimberley. At the end of your presentation, you made the observation that when everybody agrees on something, that worries you quite a bit, or words to that effect. Is that fair?
Can you say that again? What was the last?
Yes, you said that whenever you get a bunch of people, like you pointed to the CEOs, who agree on the same idea, that worries you.
Yeah, well, something that, the reason why this is of interest to me is that no one is really challenging the concept of social entrepreneurship. It's kind of taken as a given. And many of those CEOs and founders who now advocate for a higher calling for business, that's not how they attained their private fortunes. They went about it the good old-fashioned way. So if you think about even, John Mackey and Whole Foods, how he founded or how he grew the business was really the acquisition of smaller mom-and-pop shops and health food stores and things like that. So his emphasis on stakeholder capitalism only came after he had achieved success. So that's why I think really we should be focusing for students on learning those fundamental principles of how to run and manage a business, what project management looks like. A lot of institutions now provide incentives for business majors if they are doing what's known as well, I'm sure most of you know Shark Tank, right? Pitch campaigns, entrepreneurship kind of things. Most of those programs provide an incentive for students who can prove that their business has a social impact. So you had said you worked in accounting, right? If I wanted to open up my own accounting practice, or if I wanted to open up a floral shop, or if I wanted to be a mechanic, I can't apply for any sort of benefit. And if anything, I might not even take part in such pitch programs or Shark Tank things because I'm not providing a social impact, when in reality, you are. If you are providing a good product and service.
I can actually do you one better on assumptions that everybody's making that goes completely unchallenged. And that's the view that businesses exist in order to maximize shareholder profits. I teach in a business school. I survey this all the time. Overwhelmingly, all my students say, well, yes, of course. That's why businesses exist. And when I ask them, says who, they point to the same three individuals if they've done the homework and read their assignments. And they know about Milton Friedman and Levitt and Bowen. They'll say, oh, they said we have to. And my response to that is, who died and made them Pope?
Right, right.
Because that's a moral argument. The assumption that goes unchallenged that we all accept in business is that you run a business in order to make money. Now, businesses have to be solvent, of course. That's not negotiable. But that's like saying, because the human body has to breathe, therefore breathing is why we exist, is the same fallacy as saying businesses must be solvent, therefore they must make money at all costs. That's the highest imperative that they have. It's inverting the argument of means versus ends, and it opens the door to all kinds of ethical abuses and misconduct. And it also creates company cultures where your employees show up every day doing the bare minimum and they dial it in if you're lucky. And so the idea that everybody agrees on something makes you worried. It should make us worry about the very thing that it's the heart of modern business, indoctrination. And that's the appropriate word, because it's not a law of mathematics, it's not a law of finance, it's not a law of accounting, it's not a law of physics. It's a moral argument that people like Milton Friedman have made and that we've all bought into in a very unexamined sort of way.
Well, and something that I'd like to point out is also how our culture has shaped the view of business. So I mentioned Gordon Gekko, but also if you think about any movie, there's only one movie that I know of where the billionaire is actually not the villain. And if you can think of others, I'd love to know. But the only movie that I ever know of that the billionaire is not the villain is actually Batman. Other than that,
Iron Man.
What?
Iron Man.
Oh, and Iron Man. Thank you. Now I have two. Yes. So, this kind of notion, and too, as a business professor, obviously, I am, an advocate for entrepreneurial ventures. I think it's a wonderful thing if people want to start their own company. My husband runs a small business. He's an arborist, so he loves trees, right? So he's not in it for the money, but also we need to make a profit if we want our family to be sustainable. And if he is making a profit, we know that he is providing something of value, right? And so it's for students to really understand that value creation can be super powerful. And once again, that value creation has a social impact in and of itself. If my husband wants to donate trees to whoever, more power to him. So I'm not saying you can't pursue that, but I'm saying when you impose metrics or standards or these expectations, especially on students, I think it really muddies the waters in understanding.
That's exactly what we're doing when we say we have to maximize shareholder profit. You're imposing a metric, and in indoctrination, it's just that everybody does it, so it's invisible to those of us who do it.
Yeah.
It is an indoctrination, and I'm just saying so is CSR, but so is the point of view that you're arguing.
Yes.
It is a moral indoctrination, which if you want to do that, that's fine. Let's talk about it through the lens of your moral indoctrination versus the CSR moral indoctrination versus some other form of moral indoctrination. Because that's what it is.
Well, but also there's a requirement for shareholder primacy though too, and
No,
that
is not a legal document. Shareholders do not own a business; they're beneficiaries. The corporation owns itself. We think that they're owners, but they're not. They have beneficiary claims on assets, but they're free of all liability. That's not ownership. That's beneficiary.
Correct. Yes, but in terms of and I saw that there were some other hands too. But I do understand what you are saying, and I agree. I think it really should be up to the organizations, their investors, and then also being mindful, so once again, of your stakeholders. So your partners, your suppliers, your distributors, and that kind of ripple effect. It's not cut and dry. So it's something that, I think, like I said with, CSR, it's something that I'm not saying companies should or shouldn't do. I think, though, we need to have a greater focus on the principles of just how you run and manage a business versus students searching for that social impact rather than understanding, once again, how to conduct their organization effectively and efficiently.
Kimberley, your point about superheroes actually carries over into Virginia's area as well. In the original Daredevil comics, Matt Murdock was a district attorney, but in the Disney shows, he now only does defense work.
Right. I thought the indoctrination question was actually very interesting. Joseph, Hanyang University, Korea. I think as teachers, we have obligations to introduce our students to different perspectives. So maybe like CSR versus shareholder value versus something else. And then you can ask what do you think, right? And then a general comment for both professors was that I was wondering, your heterodox approach, how does that apply to does that sell well in terms of teaching and research? You mentioned that you got tenure. Do you think that your approach was that welcomed by other faculty, or did you just kind of go under the radar for both of you in terms of how do audiences respond? And then as for the Virginia, I liked your role model with all the chocolate. I was wondering if there was any fraud, if anyone stole the chocolates. Okay. Thank you.
Part of what they liked was they all got to take the chocolates home at the end. But what was interesting about it, it was a way for them to really be able to have hands-on, this is the finite amount of money that we have to deal with, and having to advocate for their priorities. So when we got to, so many of the students came into class saying, well, we know that people who are charged with crimes need all these resources. Okay, well, where are we going to take them from? Are we going to take them from the police? Are we going to take them from corrections? Where are we going to take them from to be able to balance this off? And then the person who represented victims said, wait a minute, I don't want you to take them away from the police because my car's been stolen 3 times this year. I want you to put them over there. And the person who just was ready to pull her hair out the end was the president of the city council who had to make the ultimate budget decision. And she all of a sudden was facing something very different than she had come to the class with. So it sort of came up at the last minute to have that hands-on experience where they in front of their peers had to make that decision about where this peanut butter cup was going to go.
Oh, okay, but they could take the chocolates home.
They all got to take the chocolates
so
home.
there's no fraud. Okay.
Yeah.
Who else was indicating? Oh, I'm
Yeah. No, so just briefly, so I had an article that came out in January that was published in the Journal of Free Black Thought, and Eric Smith, who's an attendee here, is a founder, and so the article is called "The Courage to Disagree in Academia, Challenging the Academic Status Quo," and I pose like a number of just like issues that should be, that should be challenged, and one of them is, you may have heard of the saying, it's not the intent, it's the impact. So I scrutinize that. I say things, you refer to somebody by like the wrong pronoun, and that was a topic of discussion earlier before our presentation. Or if you refer to somebody by the wrong race, this person shouldn't be villainized, where people give us grace. And so just challenging that's been kind of accepted as like the gospel. And so the article came out and I disseminated that widely, and it was received pretty positively, but who knows? We get evaluated every 2 years. And we'll see what my colleagues say. We all vote on each other's cases, whether or not we get raises. It's very strange in the UC system. So we'll see. But like I said, I am unafraid now.
Good for you. Who else was indicating? Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michael Regnier with Heterodox Academy. Really appreciated all these presentations today. Dr. Thompson, I had a question for you as well. So I was expecting your reexamination of the literature to be something along the lines of people are doing lots of correlation studies only, but there's not enough look at causality, and I think that is a theme you said that you found in the review. But it looked like there was some actual experimental work to try to get to the difference between group differences in actual bias or discrimination. I'm wondering, as you look at the field overall, is there progress being made to distinguish between those concepts, or do most of the studies muddy them to the point that it's really still very hard to tell? I'd love to think that with all these studies being published, there's some traction and some progress being made, but you're the one who did the systemic review. Thank you.
Yeah, so I need to just conduct, an even greater, I need to, review the literature even more to kind of arrive at that kind of conclusion. But a lot of the articles did say, this is a correlation, it's not causation. A few of those articles did say that, made that statement quite explicit. So that is really heartening. And they seem to be like very transparent in their research findings, and didn't seem to succumb to the confirmation bias, which is something that's really real in research. And so what I need to do is just kind of explore kind of to conduct a deeper analysis, a deeper systemic review to kind of see if that's kind of a trend at all. But that's an excellent point.
Thanks. Sorry, we're coming back to Miriam's point on, and actually this is a question for all of you too, or anybody in the room. Your statement on positionality statements was curious in the sense that, first of all, I totally agree with you. I find them not helpful or useful, but I'm also, as a manuscript author, oftentimes not given the option. Either I do work with Indigenous First Nations, so often my audience or my sample and my elders require me to do that positionality statement. So, or I won't submit it in my first draft, and a reviewer will say you need to put in a positionality statement. So we're a bit caught that way, but I'm just wondering if that's the experience that others have or that you have as well.
Well, it's just really interesting. It kind of depends on the field. So if you're conducting qualitative research or an ethnographic study, I think maybe it makes sense to do that. But if you're in a field like engineering, I don't think it's necessary. But that has happened. Like, again, looking at the Savulnayan article, he talks about that. But it's challenging, and I just wonder if you can ask the editor, how necessary, it is to do this. Will it, enriching the manuscript that you're submitting. And so it's a hard, it's a challenging issue to address. And if you want to be, totally honest about it.
Guys, fantastic session, really, really good. Miriam, especially, thank you for stepping in at the last minute, but everyone, brilliant.